So the student survey results are in. The survey closed on June 21st and we had nearly 1,000 respondents. So let's dive in and take a look at what these respondents had to say. We did our midterm check-in on this survey back in May. So let's take a look and see what's new. The breakdown of our respondents really remains unchanged in terms of representation from students of each domain. And what's nice about this representation is that it is really reflective of where we see the highest number of student usage per domain. So we see most of our students in the PT and PA sector, also a large number of students in nursing. We don't have as many nursing programs, but we do know that nursing programs are very large. So these are our largest stakeholders by domain. And then we actually had a very big representation in terms of responses from version 4 users. So when we compare version 3 to version 4, we've got very few students on version 4, but a lot of them responded. And a lot of them had some pretty helpful feedback and some constructive feedback to share with us that we'll take a look at in a moment. Looking at the breakdown per version, again, very reflective of the sample size of students that we see using each version. So really representative sample here. So although we only had nearly 1,000 out of almost 64,000 students to which we sent this survey, if the sample size that responds is representative, then we know that our data can really still help to inform our decisions. And that's certainly the case here. So very useful data for us. So when we asked how user-friendly do you find Exxat to be, we compared version 3 to version 4 within this year's survey. And then at the bottom, you'll also see last year's survey as a point of comparison. And students find version 4 to be more user-friendly than version 3. This is a bit of a change from when we looked at this sort of at the midterm point where it looked like both versions were created equal. But as we continued to get more and more responses, it came to light that students do find version 4 to be a little bit more user-friendly to version 3. A lot of this has to do with how easy it is to find what you're looking for, how streamlined we've made the interface. And when we look at the feedback comments, we'll see a lot of those things called out there. Looking at this domain by domain, we can really see where these differences between version 3 and version 4 come in. So PA students don't really seem to have a preference, actually, between version 3 and version 4, but our PT students seem to strongly prefer version 4, which is interesting. Looking at satisfaction of students overall, when we looked at this at the midterm point, social work seemed like a really big pain point for us. But the social work students seem to be more satisfied than they once appeared, and that's because our sample size for social work is so small. So with only 1 or 2 students saying that they find the system to be somewhat user-friendly, percentage-wise, that really inflates that number. So while we looked at social work and said we were worried about it at the midterm point, it actually turns out that social work students seem to be just as satisfied, or perhaps even more so, than each of the other domains. We asked students which were the most useful features. As I mentioned at the midterm point, we're probably going to be removing this question in the future. Creating a student profile was by and large the most useful feature according to these students, but I'm not really sure what kind of information that helps us, that gives us to help us move forward with building the system. So perhaps not the best question and something we're considering throwing out of the survey come next year. But we did ask feature by feature, how easy was it to fill in the blank? And the first one that we asked about was research clinical sites. So for our PT schools, they seem to be using this feature most frequently in version 4. And likely that's through the location-based wish list. There is no other way to research clinical sites in version 4 right now. And only about half of them found this to be even neutral. Less than 40% of them found it to be easy or extremely easy. And this is very representative of what we know about version 4 without that map of affiliation and with that location-based wish list that we continue to iterate on and clean up. But what really struck me is that PA students in version 3, many of them were researching clinical sites. You can see a small section over to the left that is blank. Looking at V4 for researching clinical sites for PA students, many of them are not even engaging in that activity. And for those that are engaging in that activity, they, largely feel either neutral or negatively about that experience. So really just a nice call out to underscore the fact that map of affiliation is a very much needed experience, a very much needed feature in version 4, and our students are looking forward to using it because it is widely used by PT and PA students, as we can see reflected in the V3 data. Building and submitting a wish list. Again, small representation from PA about building and submitting a wish list because PA schools don't typically use wish lists in the same way that PT or OT schools do. And version 4 doesn't yet support the PA style wish list. Looking at PT students, they feel similarly about it, V3 versus to V4, in terms of how many of them find it extremely easy. But comparing the two, it is clear that V3 wish lists are much more intuitive and much easier to use. We've got nearly 60% of students feel neutrally or better about wish lists in V3, and we've got about 50% of students feel neutrally or better about them in V4. So big difference in terms of version and the student experience here. Submitting assignments. Again, this is something that PA students seem to do quite a lot of in version 3, and they feel pretty good about it. But a lesser used feature across the board. Social work and nursing seem to do quite a lot of this as well. They have a much smaller sort of blank section over to the left. But again, most students, about 50%, find it to be neutral or better in version 3, and similar in version 4. So not a big difference between these two. Of course, entering a patient log, we get the bulk of our data here from our PA students. And they've given us some really good constructive feedback, and actually some of that has already been incorporated. Students raised that they were unable to search ICD-10 codes, including the decimal point. We fixed that in this upcoming V4 release. So really nice to see that we're already responding to student feedback from this survey, and that we'll continue to do so. What's interesting is when we compare version 3 to version 4, in terms of students who feel neutrally or better, our PA students are spot on between those two versions. We've got about 60% of students feeling neutrally or better about patient logging in version 3 and in version 4. So that's a nice testament to what the team has built and how well it's working for our students. Completing a timesheet, of course, is very much a nursing feature, so we see a lot of usage in the nursing domain. In V4, we see most of that coming from the PA domain, and no real surprise there. So by and large, people are feeling pretty good about entering in a timesheet for those that do. So no strong feedback really about timesheets. There were a few small items that were called out, but really nothing, no deal breakers in terms of timesheets, aside from that need to create a template. People really want to be able to create a template and apply it not only within a particular placement, but across placements. So perhaps creating a template for placement 1 or rotation 1, and using that again for rotation 3 or 4. That was one of the suggestions that we saw from students come across in terms of feedback for timesheet. And then also in version 4, we got some constructive feedback about the clock interface. One of the students actually called it, and this is a direct quote, supremely silly, which I thought was a very interesting way to describe it. But people really don't like to have that, image of a clock and click on the hour and click on the minute. They're really just looking for, quickly typing in or selecting a number from a drop down or something a little bit more straightforward or streamlined. So we got some feedback about that clock interface on version 4 when it came to timesheet as well. Getting approval for required and compliance documents. This is something that our students did say a lot about. And again, as I mentioned during the midterm check-in, these were all good things. This is actually what we want to hear. So students were kind of complaining and saying, there's a lot of back and forth with the approved team. It should be easy. Just take my document and tell me it's okay. So I actually really love that the approved team is sticking to their guns, upholding their policies and procedures and reviewing things in accordance with school guidelines. So shout out to them for continuing to do a great job. The one suggestion that we did get here from students is about getting email alerts when statuses have changed. So in V3, we only send an email when a document has been disapproved. Otherwise, they don't get an alert. They just log into the system to see that. And then in V4, sending those notifications is a manual process. After you change the status, then you have to go to a next step to send those notifications. And it seems as though students don't feel that they're getting the notifications that they need. So lots of people saying, I really should get an update. You really should let me know if a status has changed. So they're not feeling as informed as they could be, logging into the system and looking for those status updates other than disapproved in V3 or in whole in V4 isn't working as well for them as they'd like it to. So students would like to be a little bit more informed about statuses. As we saw with our midterm check-in, we have our version 4 students reaching out to support much more frequently than version 3, though this is decreasing. We saw over 50% of students were reaching out to support for version 4 back in May, and then this is coming down. Now we're at about 41%. But when we look at the students who did reach out to support, how satisfied were they? Our students continue to be incredibly satisfied with our support team, feeling that they're doing an average or better job. More than 80% of students feel that the support team is doing an average or better job. And looking at last year's numbers versus this year's numbers, we continue to stay right on track. So shout out to the support team for really taking good care of the students who do reach out. And specifically to the version 4 team, support team, for being very clear in their communication. We saw a pretty significant improvement, version 3 versus version 4, in terms of clarity of communication. But overall, wonderful job from the support team. So I mentioned there's been a lot of constructive feedback from our students, and these are the areas in which they provided constructive feedback. So CPT code and ICD code searching, those are some of the things, again, that we've already started working on. The fact that our design could be more intuitive, and this is really a lot of the feedback that we were getting from our version 3 users. They mentioned it's really hard to find where you're going. And a couple of people actually called out the instruction boxes specifically, saying that they were very, very verbose and not very helpful. So quite a few students called out that the instructions should be quick, short, and clear. And they didn't feel that they were at the current point. So that might be another nice little area for improvement for us that can help us to move towards being a little bit more intuitive. We got a lot of feedback on patient logging. Again, people are looking for the ability to create a template for a patient they may see again and again, or just the ability to decrease the number of clicks to get to a patient log, which is something that we released in version 4 in this most recent release. You can now quickly access a patient log, which is nice. People want to see patient logs and procedure logs combined together or share information, and that came through loud and clear as well. Of course, we continue to hear a lot of the things that we've been hearing all along. The ability to have an app would be great. And people are really missing the map of affiliation in version 4 and really looking for an improved interface in version 3. The ability to search and then return back to that search page after you looked at a site and see your search parameters intact there. Or the ability to search outside of a particular radius. Right now, the 500-mile radius is a limiting factor for students who want to go to a rotation that's more than 500 miles away. So some good feedback in map of affiliation as well. So let's take a look at some of the trends that we saw. Students actually had a couple of really interesting suggestions. There were a lot of them, but these ones I pulled forward as kind of thoughtful suggestions that I thought could have a nice impact on the product itself. So first and foremost, students are looking for a centralized checklist for all upcoming tasks. They have to go all over the system right now to see what's due, what's coming up, and what action is needed from them in a bunch of different places. So several students called out that they'd love to have a centralized checklist to keep them on track, and I thought that was a great suggestion. Another student suggested this idea of what they called a document locker, but somewhere to be able to upload and store documents that are not necessarily being submitted, but they're still applicable to clinical education. So a place that they can keep all of their clinical education resources, documentation, assignments, whether it's being submitted or not. So this idea of really turning Exxat into that central repository for all things ClinEd, not just the assignments that you have to do for the school. So I thought that was an interesting idea. Of course, putting frequently used items on the landing page. This is something that we've heard again and again, helping people get to what they need quickly. And the system-wide search bar, really loved this idea. Again, thinking about how many things are in version 3 and how complex the navigation is. One student suggested the idea of a system-wide search bar similar to the one that you have on your iPhone, where if you grab the screen and you pull it down, you can search within the whole phone for an app or a page or a definition or a setting. And that was something that some students suggested within our system. And I thought, gosh, that would be tough to implement, but what an amazing impact that would be. So if a student wanted to do a patient log, they could go to that home screen, go to the search bar, type in patient log, and click to go to where they want to add a patient log or something of that sort. So that was a really interesting suggestion that I found rather compelling. And of course, that feedback on instructions that I mentioned earlier. In terms of the intuitive design, this again can really help to help students understand where they're going, right? And in doing that, there are a couple of nice, quick ways that we can get that done in terms of decreasing the number of words and generally making it more user-friendly by considering the actual user workflow and the actual user experience. A number of students said, if you just sat down and watched me use the system, you would understand how all over the place this feels. A few students called that out. And I thought that was really interesting, and that idea of really considering the user's workflow and user experience. Those comments were specifically related to version 3, though I think there's value in doing this across the board. Too many clicks. Again, we continue to hear, and this is something that we've heard since day one with STEPS, is that there are a lot of ways to do the same thing. And while we initially thought that was a positive, it turns out that that is making life difficult for our users in terms of not really knowing where to go, or in terms of taking so many clicks to get to somewhere because they don't know that most direct path. So generally simplifying and streamlining the system. We heard that loud and clear. Nothing really new in terms of our CPT and ICD-10 code searching or our patient logging feedback, just a lot more of the same. So sort of unchanged here. I won't bother going through these points because we did that in May. Nothing new. We continue to hear a lot of the same things coming back to us in this area. And of course, in V4, we heard loud and clear, again, continuing with many of those things that we discussed in May, but 2 new call outs here. One is the need for map of affiliation. Students who used version 3 and have now moved over to version 4 are really missing it, really missing that ability to search and explore what clinical sites are available to them. And as I said, a good number of people disliking that clock interface for timesheets. So that's what our students had to say to us and the update on where we stand. Of course, we'll do this survey again next spring for students at that time. And we'll go through the same process. So we'll keep our questions consistent to allow us to track trends year over year. And I'll continue to follow up with you guys with summary videos and slides to help you understand how our students are feeling. Please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions about the survey or any suggestions about additional questions or ways that we can improve this in the coming years. Thanks very much.